when someone's buying a property, just having nearby industry that could be polluting, that's a huge red flag.
While East Chicago is along the shores of Lake Michigan, the city has always been surrounded by heavy industry. In this video, I'm going to be telling you what makes East Chicago the most polluted city in Indiana.
Oh yes, East Chicago, the land of never-ending chemical storage tanks, aging steel mills, and in some parts, toxic soil. In this video I talk to an environmental consultant and a longtime resident of a historic East Chicago neighborhood. I also show you a failed Section 8 housing project that was built at the site of an old lead refinery. East Chicago is not only considered to be the most polluted city in Indiana, but also it's one of the worst contaminated areas in the entire country. It's a city that today is home to about 25,000 residents, a far cry from its 1960 peak of 57,000. Back in the day, immigrants from all kinds of backgrounds flocked to the city to work at the steel mills, oil refineries, chemical plants, and lead smelters. The heavy blue-collar presence earned East Chicago the nickname of Steeltown. Today, the Indiana Harbor and Ship Canal continues to be dominated by the BP oil refinery and the Indiana Harbor Works, which is a steel mill that's operated by Cleveland Cliffs. While those facilities continue to have a large presence in the area today, industrial activity is not near to the level that it used to be. Industries of the good times past provided well for many of the families from generations ago, but that activity came at a cost and has left behind a toxic legacy that negatively affects the environment and the health of the current residents. Not only are a good portion of the jobs from generations ago no longer available, and not only are today's East Chicago residents living in a heavily contaminated environment, but today, 1 out of every 4 East Chicago residents are living in poverty. Speaking of poverty, this drone shot was taken in the area of 149th Street and McCook Avenue, looking west at the former site of the West Calumet housing complex, which was a Section 8 housing project that was built all the way back in 1970 on top of toxic soil, as the site used to be home to the Anaconda White Lead Company, which processed lead for decades.
Yeah, so in our industry, I mostly monitor pollutants from industrial wastewater and also do soil samples and tons of random jobs, but I used to do some site assessments here and there. And one of the things is you would look into the history. So if someone's selling their property, you would look up historical documents to see what industries are there.
And when making a YouTube video on the subject, you also look at historic documents, so that's what I did. And what I found was that the Anaconda White Lead Company was a lead smelting plant that processed not only lead, but also arsenic from 1912 to 1954. However, it wasn't just this lead smelting plant that contributed to create what is now known as the USS Lead Superfund site, as there was a chemical company that operated at 5215 Kennedy Avenue for a century before closing in 2000. That was the DuPont facility, which processed lead, arsenic, zinc oxide, and zinc chloride. The Delamar Copper Refinery built their facility at 5300 Kennedy Avenue in 1906, only for it to shortly be known as USS Lead, with operations coming to an end in 1985. When these homes were built in Zones 2 and 3 on the map back in 1939, the fill-in soil used during construction was contaminated with industrial waste from the nearby facilities. Now, I know it's against the law to practice neurology without a license, but I'm going to do it anyway, so you can label me a felon. What living on these contaminated former industrial properties does to a child's brain is life-changing, and not in a good way. Lead, arsenic, and other toxic chemicals that industries have left behind can easily get into the bloodstream and negatively affect the brain development of children.
The fact that, they had a steel plant here, all this industry, and then put housing on top of it, I mean, that is a huge red flag. It's pretty mind-blowing. And with the levels of lead in the soil, the people who are most at risk are young children, because you don't want to ingest the soil.
pretty ironic that a water tower that says "For Our Children" hovers above the USS lead Superfund site. Hopefully that's a sign of commitment to clean up everything once and for all. Anyway, fast forward to the 1960s and the lead smelting facility that stood on this property was demolished. Then in 1970, construction started on the West Calumet housing complex. The two other industrial facilities that have contributed to this mess, however, were still in operation just a stone's throw to the south. In 1992, the site was first proposed to be a Superfund site, but it wasn't until 2009 when the EPA declared 322 acres of land within East Chicago to be the USS lead Superfund site. It took that long to determine it to be as such, despite the Indiana Department of Environmental Management first finding high levels of lead in the soil all the way back in 1985. Or 24 years prior to the site gaining Superfund status. It was also proven that the lead particles were present in the air downwind from the plant that year.
All that lead poisoning in the soil is, and you have families, poor income, low income families living there. It's just pretty sad.
It is sad that it took so long because there's articles out there that if you go searching for them, you'll find them. These articles will feature lifelong residents of the West Calumet neighborhood here in East Chicago who went their entire lives not knowing that their homes were built on top of soil that was poisoning them. In 2009, there were numerous properties with soil samples within zones 2 and 3 that had lead levels that were higher than 1,200 parts per million. Levels were even higher in the West Calumet housing complex. In fact, the EPA stated that the layer of toxic soil extended for 2 feet. So that's how far you would have to dig until you would find native sand, otherwise known as clean soil. Even in 1997, the EPA took 29 soil samples throughout East Chicago and found lead levels to be high enough to warrant emergency action in 8 of the soil samples. Plus, in 2016, an EPA study revealed that there was dangerously high levels of lead within the city's drinking water. Regardless, there were just over 1,000 people living at the West Calumet housing complex when the neighborhood gained Superfund site status, but it wasn't until 2016 when the housing complex closed. Since the majority of the residents that live within the Superfund site were either Black or Latino, residents were able to file and win a legal settlement that alleged housing discrimination on the part of the East Chicago Housing Authority for locating them in a poor, segregated community with serious levels of environmental contamination. So what's been done to clean things up since 2009? I mentioned prior that the housing complex was demolished in 2023 and cleanup has been ongoing. A group called IDA, or Industrial Development Advantage, has acquired the 55-acre site of Zone 1 and has assumed environmental liabilities. At the time of me making this video, the EPA claims that over a 2.5-year stretch, since the fall of 2023, over 84,000 tons of contaminated soil has been excavated from the site and has been replaced with 34,000 tons of clean fill-in soil. As of July of 2024, about 85% of the cleanup activity had been completed, with the remaining work consisting of bringing in and spreading clean fill-in soil. Eventually, the site will be repurposed for future development. As for Zones 2 and 3, or the portion of the Superfund site that's east of McCook Avenue, the EPA says that they've completed soil sampling at all 597 properties in Zone 2, with all 510 properties that required cleanup having been cleaned up and restored to safe conditions. Same story for Zone 3, which saw 481 properties get soil sampled, with all 297 properties that required cleanup being cleaned up, and the EPA states that there are no plans to conduct further soil sampling or remediation within Zones 2 and 3. When it comes to the drinking water, East Chicago is like many other Rust Belt cities or older cities that are east of the Mississippi River in the fact that the service lines are made of lead. So congratulations, if you live in an older city east of the Mississippi River, it's very likely that you have lead service lines underneath your streets. However, when a city is facing a crisis with lead in its tap water, it's almost always due to a change in the way that the water is treated. Now, I don't have a degree of any sorts in science or chemistry, but the concept is simple enough for most to understand. Here's what happened. Back in 2009, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management approved East Chicago's use of hexametaphosphate to treat the drinking water. The implement of it was to treat high levels of iron in East Chicago's water. Here's the real kicker though, the state approved it and the city of East Chicago implemented this practice despite articles from as early as 1940 showing concerns over the use of hexametaphosphate to treat drinking water. Not only do some experts think that that compound is ineffective in treating water that's high in iron, but it can actually worsen the quality of water by dislodging lead from the pipes that it passes through into the drinking water. Another study from 2002 is more clear in what the problems are with the compound when it comes to treating water that passes through lead and copper pipes. Mark Edwards, who is a professor at Virginia Tech, confirms that while hexametaphosphate is effective in controlling the amount of iron and manganese in drinking water, it's not ideal for use in either lead or copper pipes, as it increases the release of both soluble and particulate forms of those metals in drinking water. As far as whether or not the problem is fixed, it appears that the city of East Chicago is actively replacing the lead lines that connect the mains to the residents' homes throughout the city. It could take a very long time before all of that gets completed due to the expenses and how such projects get funded. From one troubled East Chicago neighborhood to a former troubled East Chicago neighborhood, problems were handled a little bit differently in what used to be the Brickyard neighborhood. The story of this neighborhood just illustrates that East Chicago has had a long history of pollution affecting the residents. Brickyard was a really small neighborhood that was established in the 1920s as a neighborhood for laborers at a nearby Brickyard facility. It was located on the northeast side of the Kennedy Avenue and Chicago Avenue intersection. Ironically, that's just north of the Calumet neighborhood. Since massive industrial developments with poor planning took over the former swamplands early, residential demands rose and there was nowhere to build new homes other than right next to these large industrial zones. Over time, Brickyard became primarily an African-American neighborhood surrounded by polluting industries. By 1986, about 30 black families lived there, according to the Northwest Indiana Times. That year, however, a new company set up shop right next to the neighborhood, that company being called Pollution Control Industries, or PCI. PCI's operations ran at the address of 4343 Kennedy Avenue. Activity at the plant consisted of blending hundreds of hazardous chemicals to use as fuel for industrial furnaces. At this point, it would have been more accurate to call the neighborhood Chemical Yard rather than Brickyard. The company expanded to border the Brickyard neighborhood in 3 directions, pretty much making Brickyard an enclave of PCI's property. It didn't take long before the fumes from the chemicals made the residents sick on nearly a daily basis. A 1994 article from the Northwest Indiana Times states that at the time of that article being published, the residents of Brickyard were evacuated from their homes 3 times in the prior 3 years due to explosions and fires at the plant. By that time in the mid-90s, most of Brickyard had become blighted due to people leaving and being unable to sell their homes to any potential home buyer as the pollution there was so bad. Basically, anybody who had the financial means to leave had left by that time. Also in the mid-90s, the city of East Chicago put a plan together to buy out the remaining homes due to the close proximity to all the toxic air pollution that was produced by PCI. By 1995, Brickyard was completely evacuated as the site was designated as a redevelopment site by the city. The residents were bought out and all of the homes were torn down shortly after. Northwest Indiana Times articles from the mid-90s explained that the last residents who lived in the Brickyard neighborhood were mostly elderly black people who had lived in Bricktown their entire lives. Several articles from the newspaper company continued to explain how most of the residents were scared of what was happening and were unsure of what to expect for their future living situations. And even though doing that was for the better, moving residential zoning away from industrial contamination, it just goes to show you how hard it is for a government entity to get people to move away from their homes. We see examples of this across Superfund sites and other industrial contaminated sites all across the country, whether it's a poor black neighborhood in the city, whether it's a poor white neighborhood out in the country, or it could be a wealthier suburban neighborhood. It doesn't matter. You can find examples like this all over the country. Regardless, it came to my surprise that there are hardly any pictures of Brickyard from when it was still standing online. At least, there was none that I could find. But mentioning the story of that neighborhood goes hand in hand with the topic of this video. Another thing you can't go without mentioning in a video about East Chicago would be the Indiana Harbor. Today, the site is dominated by the BP oil refinery, which is the largest of its kind in the Midwest, and the 6th largest nationally, as it produces 440,000 barrels of crude oil per day. The Cleveland Cliffs steel mill takes up most of the rest of the space, and despite being one of the largest steelmaking facilities in the country, it doesn't have near the bad track record of violations that the BP oil refinery has. While technically the BP oil refinery is in Whiting, All of East Chicago is downwind from the refinery, so that means that BP is heavily polluting the air that hovers above East Chicago. The BP oil refinery has been hit numerous times over the years for violating regulations, including a record-setting fine of $40 million back in 2023. $9 million of that went to the state of Indiana, while $31 million went to the U.S. Treasury. The violations included releasing excess amounts of pollutants into the air and wastewater. The U.S. Department of Justice and the EPA described the penalty as being the largest ever under the Clean Air Act for pollution from a structure. Additionally, BP invested around $197 million in improvements, or so they said. It wasn't just one violation by this refinery, as if you do a search for the facility, you'll find countless amounts of news stories covering things ranging from tank leaks, dumping millions of pounds of pollutants into Lake Michigan, and being sued in 2019 for basically the same reasons that it was fined a record amount of $40 million 4 years later in 2023. So at this point, it's not a question of when BP will not violate regulations, more so, it's when they will get caught again. Not even a mile downwind from the Whiting BP oil refinery is the historic Marktown neighborhood. Not many people are left, but one loyal resident who is known as being the unofficial mayor of Marktown plans on staying here for the rest of his life.
Despite what people think, it's a very clean community. It's a community that works together. We used to have a better mark on that than we do now.
The historic district is literally surrounded by the Cleveland Cliffs, Indiana harbor operations and the BP oil refinery. Named after Chicago industrialist Clayton Mark.
What up, Clayton Mark?
Marktown originated in 1917 as a planned community for factory workers. Upon opening his factory, most of northwest Indiana was undeveloped. So, in order for his workers to have a place to live, Mark purchased the land that was to be his new town back in 1913. The original plans called for housing for up to 8,000 workers and supervisors on a plot of land that was slightly larger than 20 acres. The town was to feature a market square along with a major post office, an elementary school, a high school, a theater, a recreational center, and a large park that would serve as a buffer between the town and the neighboring industries. Notable Chicago architect Howard Van Doren Shaw,
What up, Howard Van Doren Shaw?
was hired to design the community.
The architect, Howard Van Doren Shaw, designed the Mentor building in Chicago. Now that's Howard right there. That's the statue too, and the medallion. Now the house that's right, the Christmas tree ornament right there, is a Marktown quad. And Ragdale put that out. It's actually Ragdale, but you can see the Ragdale's there.
His design included picturesque style homes along extremely narrow streets, with only 5 different building designs for the homes. He positioned the homes in the neighborhood in varied ways to avoid a monotonous look. Shaw also made sure to put homes up at the ends of each street in the neighborhood to block the views of the surrounding industry. However, when you look down the streets of the neighborhood today, most often you'll see what was meant to be blocked out. Despite original plans calling for the neighborhood to be home to around 8,000 people, World War I forced a stop in the construction of the community, so only 4 of the 30 planned sections were able to be completed. Today, Marktown is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, despite being in the middle of heavy industrial zoning. Today, a quarter of the homes stand vacant, while well-preserved homes are standing right next to others that are falling apart.
You were explaining to me some of these pictures up here. How has Marktown changed over the years?
The easiest way to say is that people have enough money to move out to somewhere else. I talked to David and his wife just the other day, and he's younger than I. Helped him through baseball equipment and everything, and we were headed down to Crown Point. And even in Hessville, there's $250,000 homes.
When did the library close?
ages ago. Matter of fact, that's when the whole block down there was
Looks like you have all the books from the library right here.
Shows the mill. Original photographs of the mill.
Picture, yeah. It's a beautiful picture.
Now these are original photos that I just had printed and did this. That's the coker. You know what a coker is?
I don't know exactly what it is,
Well,
but I know
they take
it's...
coal and they heat it, so it's coke.
Yeah.
Now, coke for these houses used to be coal-fired. And I can show you where some of the coal chutes still are. They aren't there. They would use coke. They'd stoke the fire with coke because it burnt faster and quicker to get everything running. Go ahead. These are all mill shots. And that's where they're pushing the coke out.
What an incredible photo.
The homes were built really close together in Marktown on purpose. It was intended to be a concept that provided a sense of community, whereas most of America today has gone with the trend of large single-family homes on private lots. Well, really quick, as if you enjoy this video as much as Paul enjoys talking about the history and sharing knowledge about Marktown, make sure to find the subscribe button down below, hit that, hit the like button, and let me know what you think about Marktown in the comments. Or you could let me know what you think about anything else that I've talked about in this video. Also, if you really like what I do, you can join Team Invader through YouTube memberships. The link is down below. Becoming a member will give you access to members-only community posts and videos, and I'll always see your comments before I see others. Additionally, you can join Team Invader Plus for a monthly Q&A on the first Saturday of each month, where I can talk to you and you can talk to me and we can be friends.
I like you. Do you like me? I do.
All funds generated from YouTube memberships goes towards future travel and equipment expenses, which ultimately helps me continue to make new videos. What also helps with making better videos is having things to talk about, and there's yet even more things to mention about East Chicago. Before any development took place here, northwest Indiana was flat, and there was quite an expansive wetland area to complement Lake Michigan. This map of Lake County from 1874 doesn't even show a place called East Chicago, let alone Marktown, let alone Whiting, and Hammond was just a dinky little square block area south of the Grand Calumet River along the Illinois border. However, 19 years later, in 1893, the city of East Chicago was incorporated. This next map from 1906 shows a town called East Chicago and another town called Indiana Harbor. Marktown wasn't even constructed yet, as we're still about 10 years away from that, but Marktown eventually would get built right here. You can see, however, that by 1906, railroads were built and the industrial landscape is starting to take shape. When this map was published, the Indiana Harbor and Ship Canal was being constructed to connect Lake Michigan with the Grand Calumet River, and the steel mill had just recently opened. What's also important to note about this era is with East Chicago being separated from Indiana Harbor, East Chicago was known as the Twin City, with the rail yard sitting in between the two being referred to as the Rail Gateway to Chicago and the West. The name Indiana Harbor stopped appearing on maps in the 1930s when the Columbus Drive overpass was built, connecting the two towns. From the very start, East Chicago was known as a cultural melting pot with immigrants from all over the world coming to work at the nearby industries. Nicknames were given to the city such as the Arsenal of America with its manufacturing during World War I, and at other times people referred to East Chicago as the Workshop of America. Things have changed quite a bit since the good times passed though, and not in a good way. Here's a postcard image of Michigan Avenue that was pulled from the East Chicago website. With the streetcar line in the middle and no cars on the street, it's safe to assume that this photo was from around 1910 maybe? That's my best guess. Well, Michigan Avenue today doesn't look anything like what we saw in the photo. At least Main Street a few blocks over looks a little bit more lively. Anyway, East Chicago hit a peak population of just over 57,000 back in 1960, and today that number is down to below 26,000. Decades of economic decline starting in the 1970s has been a large contributor, along with white flight, or you could even say financial flight. That might be more accurate because we're seeing minority families with the ability to leave do so. More and more people are realizing that it's not healthy to live in East Chicago with all of the industrial pollutants, and as time has gone on, more and more people have been able to catch on to that and they're leaving town. Not only that, but the thousands upon thousands of jobs that helped build East Chicago are not as available as they used to be. I haven't yet even mentioned the history of organized crime and corruption that's gone on here, which is another common trait among these old Rust Belt cities, unfortunately so. Especially around the ones that are near Chicago. Well, the Lone Lake, Michigan waterfront park in town is named Giroux Beach, after former East Chicago Mayor Walter Giroux. It probably shouldn't be, though, as he was as corrupt as they come. Being elected mayor in 1951, Giroux put together a staff of young men to run the city, who were all his yes men. Anyone who disagreed with him would be removed from their positions. One example of that would be the city's first Mexican-American elected official, Joseph Maravilla. Once he refused to hire Giroux's friends for positions within the school city of East Chicago, however, Maravilla was let go, despite agreeing with pretty much everything Giroux said at first. Well, at the time, the city's administration was full of just one party, that being the Democratic Party, and all of those men were yes men who bowed down to Giroux. Apparently, the city is still bowing down to him by naming the lakefront park after him. In 1964, it was time for the next mayor, Dr. John B. Nicosa. It's this guy here on the far right. This photo was from 1972. Nicosa was focused on expensive urban renewal projects for which his administration accepted bribes and kickbacks for. In fact, Nicosa was the one who led the way in tearing down the old Anaconda white lead smelting facility and replacing it with the West Calumet housing project. In case you forgot what I showcased earlier in the video, the soil on that property was heavily contaminated with lead and arsenic for decades, so much so that it was designated as a Superfund site in 2009. Nicosa didn't care about that though, and he didn't care if it was unhealthy for humans to live there because he just wanted to make sure that he got his money. Nicosa received bribes for not only getting the lead smelting facility torn down, but he also pocketed more than $100,000 in kickbacks for helping the West Calumet housing project get completed. Doing that also helped East Chicago continue to receive millions of federal urban renewal money through the budget, so clearly, the plan was to quickly come up with something so that money could keep coming through, and he ended up creating one of the worst contaminated places for people to live in the entire country for decades to come. Additionally, Nicosa ended a 15-year relationship with a nonprofit that oversaw the urban renewal in the city, saying that things were moving too slow. Well, after Nicosa left office, he and his administration were accused of diverting over $2 million of public funds. Those funds were intended for a water pollution and sewer project, but instead, they went to public officials and contractors. Regardless, Nicosa was found guilty of bribery and was sentenced to 5 years in prison, along with a $10,000 fine.
Thank you, come again.
But of course, he ended up only having to pay $5,000 rather than $10,000, and he served no jail time despite being found guilty of bribery. The mayor to follow Nicosa wasn't any better. Robert Pastrick is the city's longest-serving mayor on record, having served from 1971 all the way to 2004. Pastrick started his career by participating as one of Giroux's yes men. Pastrick was charged of voter fraud in 2003, and the Indiana Supreme Court ordered a special election to be held the following year, in which Pastrick lost. That wasn't the first time that he partook in such activity, however, because in 2004 the state attorney filed a civil racketeering suit against Pastrick through a scandal called Sidewalks for Votes that occurred in 1999. Pastrick diverted $24 million of public money that was intended to pave concrete sidewalks and other landscape work along the streets in exchange for votes. Pastrick and two of his allies were ordered to pay $108 million to the city, and he received no jail time. Many members of his administration did see jail time, however, and Pastrick was able to file for bankruptcy to avoid paying the $108 million he owed the city.
Your credit card has been declined. Please select a different payment method.
All of that, and the city's library is still named after him. Well, really quick, as if you want to see more of what East Chicago looks like, I'll have a second video that I'll upload on my second channel called Chris Harden's Video Archives, where I'll show you all of the footage that I filmed but didn't use in this video. Don't mind the 4,960 subscriber count. YouTube is lying. It's actually 4.9 million subscribers. I've tried to talk to YouTube about it, but they won't respond. Anyway, I've been told that the content on that channel is up for Emmy Awards. I'm not sure which videos exactly. That's just what I've been told. So make sure to check out my second video once it's uploaded. The link will be down below once it is. Well, people, it is now that time. In East Chicago, you can't trust the name in front of your library, just like how you can't always trust the Tooth Fairy, but you can always trust Chris's livability score.
Education.
East Chicago isn't known for its Harvard applicants, although I'm sure there's a few Ivy Leaguers that stem from this town here and there. Look, anything is possible when you try and put in that work. Regardless, going to school in East Chicago doesn't give a kid the best chances according to the data. East Chicago Central High School is ranked 307th out of 395 Indiana high schools according to US News. Only 8% of high schoolers score proficiently in math, only 22% score proficiently in reading, and only 4% in science, which all three of those levels are well below the state average. Additionally, the graduation rate is 66%, which isn't good at all. Education gets a 2 out of 20.
Crime.
The crime rates in East Chicago aren't good, but they're also not the worst. Several cities in Indiana rank lower in safety. The violent crime rate is 803 per 100,000 residents, or over twice the national average, while the property crime rate is 2,200 per 100,000 residents, or just slightly above the national average. Crime gets a 6 out of 20.
Downtown.
I think that downtown East Chicago has good structure. It has good potential, but that being said, I don't know if this place is ever going to see any kind of new businesses move in. It's optically pleasing, and it's about as optically pleasing as you could expect a city like East Chicago's downtown to be. But the future worries me. It gets a 9 out of 20.
Economy.
The economy is dirt poor. The residents have more than double the average poverty rate, and only one city in Indiana has a higher poverty rate, that being its next door neighbor in Gary. Basically, most of the residents who have the means to do so are leaving town and aren't coming back. When kids graduate high school, they leave, and they don't come back, whether that's living in another suburban city, living in Chicago, or they move away from the area altogether. There are still plenty of industries that operate in town, however, for the city to collect tax revenue from. Economy gets a 3 out of 20.
Environment.
Please, what a joke. 0 out of 20.
Recreation.
There's a few parks in town, but not much. Lake Michigan is the saving grace, but I don't know about you. All I know is that I'd rather take a dip in the Great Blue Sea 60 miles to the north and east than taking one right here where the BP oil refinery dumps millions of pounds of pollutants into the lake. Otherwise, with East Chicago's grungy, gritty industrial landscape, along with the neighboring cities being the same way, you'd have to drive quite a ways before you get to some satisfying outdoor recreation areas. Indiana Dunes is probably the best option, and that's a half hour away. Recreation gets a 5 out of 20, and it's only that high because, unlike me, there are some people who aren't bothered at all by the sights and smells of the BP oil refinery, and they'll bring their surfboards over to these beachfront parks along Lake Michigan despite the nearby industries. I've seen it, and tell me where else you can surf in Indiana.
History.
Well, time for some positivity. The history of this town is rather fascinating, just like it is with many Rust Belt cities. Once upon a time, East Chicago was a great industrial utopia providing good salaries for tens of thousands of families. You know, history alone sometimes can be enough for people to band together and try to save their community from falling any further, and that has value. It creates some sort of community pride. History gets a 13 out of 20.
Amenities.
I didn't see too many amenities when driving around East Chicago, did you? There's a handful of grocery stores, but you have to drive over to Hammond and other areas further south if you want your selections of Walmart, Meijer, Target, Aldi, etc., etc. Downtown had more amenities than anywhere else in the city, and even downtown could use some more occupancy. Amenities gets a 4 out of 20.
Cost of living.
This is easily the highest scoring category for East Chicago, 20 out of 20 there. It does come at the cost of your health though. Some parts of town are worse than others. At the time of me uploading this video in May of 25, the most expensive home listing on Zillow was a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom dwelling going for $245,000, which for the housing market in May of 2025, that's affordable. All in all, the Chris Livability score for East Chicago, Indiana is 62 out of 180, ranking it dead last among all Indiana places that I've done this for so far. Not quite for all of the places I've done throughout the country though. Well, just upwind of the BP oil refinery is the town of Whiting, Indiana, which has a really cute downtown, and it fares a little bit better on the Chris Livability score. Check out that video to see why. I'll see you over in Whiting. Peace.
Thank you, come again.